Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. First, let me once again thank UMAA for inviting me to speak at your annual conference. It's always a pleasure to be here and to speak to you, particularly on these issues at this crucial time for Islam in North America. On the one hand, we have to recognize that the voices who don't believe that Muslims belong here are louder than ever. There's the Glenn Becks and the Daniel Pipeses who continue to respond to the presence of Muslims in America in absolutely bizarre ways. There are a minority of Americans right now who believe that the fact that we have the first Muslim American Miss USA is a plot by Hezbollah. You can find this. Or that President Obama is a secret Muslim, or at the very least has capitulated to Islam. And it is a sad coincidence that as we are having this meeting today, Sex and the City 2 has opened around the USA, reinforcing numerous stereotypes about Muslims in the Middle East by taking Carrie and her friends to Abu Dhabi, where they encounter Hollywood's idea of real-life Muslims. But at the same time, things are looking up. There are new media outlets that effectively and intelligently provide a Muslim voice, such as illumimag.org, which is a wonderful website. There are progressive Muslims like Ibo Patel who have risen to positions of prominence as important voices for religious tolerance, not just among Muslims, but among all religious groups in America. And Muslims are increasingly becoming an important aspect of American culture, but part of my talk today is that Muslims have for a long time been an important part of American culture. Look back at the jazz scene of the 20th century. Not only were there Muslims involved in that, but they were really cool Muslims that non-Muslims looked up to. There were Muslim musicians like Ahmed Jamal and Art Blakey and Yusuf Lateef, and others who weren't Muslim themselves but were deeply influenced by Islam, like John Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders, who named his landmark album Tawheed after the Arabic word for the unity of God. There's Richard Thompson, who I know is British, but he lives in California and is probably the greatest player of the Stratocaster who ever lived. And of course, rap music is full of important artists, Muslims like Mos Def and Brother Ali. Muslim comedians include Aziz Ansari, The Daily Show's Asif Manvi, and of course, Ohio native Dave Chappelle. Who could deny that these are very cool people and that they're Americans as well as Muslims? Noted Muslim American writers include Michael Knight, Abdul Hai Daniel Moore, and Moja Kaf, all of whom, at least in my opinion, are remarkably cool and hip and distinctively American Muslim voices. And looming over the whole scene is the complex and multivocal figure of Malcolm X, a person of great talents and greater controversy, but undeniable hipness and undeniable Americanness. I find this conference personally serendipitous because for the last semester I've been teaching a seminar at Kenyon on Islam in North America, and I must say that it's wonderful for me to note that for the first time Islam in America is being taken seriously by scholars. Not only is there Professor Takim's book, but there's Jamila Karim's remarkable book on women in Islam in America. There's Edward Curtis's books on African American Islam, and the works of Professor Sherman Jackson, who I'll talk about more detail in a moment, and the work of the Arab American novelist Moja Kaf, the autobiographical writings of Michael Muhammad Knight. There is finally a body of literature on Islam in North America that is asking serious questions about who we are and what our role in American culture and society ought to be. Now, I have entitled this talk, Finding Our Way, because I'm an academic who came to the academy after postmodernism, and I'm obsessed with words and their ambiguity. Let us briefly think about the word way. In the context of Islam, the concept of ways and paths have always been essential. Think of the number of technical terms that refer to ways in Islam. The Sharia is a road or a path, a word taken from the path to a place where life-giving water was to be found. The Sunnah is literally a trodden path. What a wonderful metaphor. A tradition is a path worn in the wilderness by our spiritual ancestors. A tariqat is a path or a road from the Zahri to the Batini. The seeker after mystical truth is not only a murid or an ashik, he or she is also a salik, a traveler. Islam is about ways, and the history of Islam is the history of Muslims looking for their paths. In the realm of American politics, we might and should ask, is there a way, a political way that can be seen as in accord with the spirit of Islam, a way that is ours, a way that is both Muslim and American? Which leads us to the possessive adjective, our. Who is the we, the us, that we should speak about in the context of finding our way? The concept of us is always tricky. The Ummah in America, as the previous speakers have said, is remarkably diverse. And in my opinion, that's one of our greatest strengths. Even in this room, a largely Shia group, we have South Asians, we have Arabs, we have Iranians. The Ahl Bayt tradition is itself diverse. Does our we include Ismailis, Alavis, Bektashis, as well as exoteric Isna Asharis? And the Isna Asharis are also diverse. As Professor Takim has so compellingly pointed out, Shia Muslims have tended to congregate religiously in community centers that are ethnic, not because they're trying to be separatists, but because people want to venerate the Ahl Bayt with the traditions that are meaningful to them. And I would argue that there's a strength in that sometimes our Sunni brothers and sisters lose. I think some of the move to Salafism among Sunnis is because in trying to get past ethnicness, the sense of being historically Muslim with certain particular historical past, they say, well, if we just focus on ibadat alone, which is all in Arabic and is all the same, and just get rid of all that pesky history and culture, we'll be okay. But of course, that's a problem, because our culture is part of what makes us human. It's part of what the strength of Islam is. Who are we? To complicate things even more, when we say we sometimes mean all Muslims, particularly on many crucial political issues, immigration, profiling, foreign policy. We sometimes see ourselves as standing shoulder to shoulder with our Sunni brothers and sisters. We understand a common language of terms. We all know what a hadith is, what happens during Ramadan, what namaz is, what a hijab is. We have a common discourse. So just who is this American Ummah that has this common discourse? It is largely Sunni, but as you all know, it's also Twelver, and it's also Ismaili. And it contains people who treasure the Sufi tradition, as well as others who completely reject it. It is immigrant, Arab, Iranian, South Asian, and it is American. Sometimes our we or us is American. A lot of times when we use the word we, we're referring to ourselves as Americans, particularly me, whose grandparents came here from Eastern Europe, but somehow I've never questioned whether or not I'm really American, until I tell people I'm Muslim. We speak as Americans. We are as American as apple pie, or pizza pie, or kibbeh. And we often forget or ignore, however, that our Ummah is significantly African American. Nearly 1/3 of the Ummah in North America is African American, and the experience of African American Muslims is crucial to the history of the Ummah in America. As Sherman Jackson, himself an African American and an excellent scholar of Islam, has pointed out, quote, among the great Western democracies, America is unique in that the largest single group of its Muslims consists of indigenous converts. Whatever our way might be, I believe that the experience of African American Muslims needs to be considered. They, in many ways, represent the conscience of American Islam, reminding us of the need to keep on the path of social justice. It is a remarkable and important book, Islam and the Black American, Looking Toward the Third Resurrection. Jackson examines the complicated relationship between African American Islam and the Islam brought by immigrants. Professor Jackson's book is subtle and complex, and I don't want to do it injustice by oversimplifying it, but the basic argument is this. African Americans came to Islam in the 20th century by a process that was rooted in an understanding that at its core, Islam must be understood as a response to white supremacy. The first resurrection was rooted in the tradition of noble Drew Ali and Master Farad and Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam. These charismatic figures convinced a significant number of African Americans who were suffering under the weight of institutions of white supremacy that the religion of Islam, however much the Islam they offered appeared to be different from the historical Islam of Eurasia and North Africa, provided avenues of resistance to evil, and I use that word quite consciously, the evil of white supremacy, that was manifested both in the transatlantic slave trade, that dumped people into cargo holds knowing that a quarter or a third of them would die, but we'd still make a profit, who stripped people of their culture and their language, who separated families, who killed millions over the course of the 19th century. It was evil. And the Jim Crow that followed it. The religious tradition of Master Farad and Elijah Muhammad upheld the proposition that the central preoccupation of black religion must be the desire to annihilate or at least subvert white supremacy and anti-black racism. Now let me be clear. The Islam presented in the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and taught in 120, you all know the story of Yaqub, who was the maker of the grafted white devils that, came to dominate the world and enslave black persons. That may sound like a real fairy story to us, and it is in terms of the narrative of Islam, but think about what it meant to people who had been told that they weren't even really human and were put in institutions like that. When you ask the question, why was there slavery? Why was the rape of black women considered to be okay? Why would Woodrow Wilson not let black people into the White House but stand outside and watch the Klan march down it? Simple. White people are the devil. It made sense. Most of you know the story of Malcolm X. It's almost too easy to not tell it because it's there. Malcolm was the smartest kid in his classroom in Lansing, Michigan, and when he said he wanted to be a lawyer, his teacher said, no, you can't because you're black. You need to be a Pullman car operator. You need to have a job as a carpenter. You can't be a lawyer. And ultimately, Malcolm X became a petty criminal and wound up in prison, where somebody came to him with these teachings that the reason you've suffered, the reason black people have suffered is that white people are evil. And he became a proponent of that until he had a falling out with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and went on the Hajj. And on the Hajj, for the first time, he saw this mass of the Ummah that was every color of the rainbow, including white people. And white people who didn't treat him like he was less than human, who treated him as a brother Muslim. And so he came back, transformed by that experience, with a new vision of how to proceed. But this did not mean that Malcolm X moved away from his commitment to ending white supremacy, or that he no longer believed that white supremacy was the great and indelible sin at the center of America. His approach to that sin was transformed, as was his relationship with the larger Ummah. The great Arab-American novelist Moshe Kaf has said that Malcolm X functions in some ways like an American Imam Hussein. His own martyrdom becomes an analogy to Karbala, a spiritual event that is endlessly interpretable. It's amazing the number of converts who came to Islam after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X or seeing Spike Lee's film of that book. Malcolm towers in American Islam partially because the issue of race in American politics remains a central issue, an issue that has never been fully addressed, let alone resolved. What most Americans do not know is that following the death of Elijah Muhammad, the overwhelming majority of members of the Nation of Islam followed his son and successor, Imam Warathin Muhammad, into historical Islam. Imam Muhammad incorporated traditional Islamic rituals, emphasized the study of Arabic, and stressed the connection of his community to the historical global Ummah. But Imam Muhammad never forgot, nor did he move away from the idea of Islam as resistance to white supremacy. And you can find this in remarkable speeches that we can now all see on YouTube, whatever we want to. And neither did the African American Muslim community. One of the people who came into Islam through this tradition is the hip-hop artist Brother Ali from Minneapolis. In fact, Brother Ali attends the same mosque that Keith Ellison goes to. Brother Ali is not African American. He's white. In fact, he's albino, which is one of the things that makes him feel very much like an outsider in which he talks about it. He came to Islam after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and actually embraced it through the tradition of Imam Warathin Muhammad, who he got to meet personally. Ali is a dedicated Muslim who entered Islam through the movement of Warathin Muhammad. And for him, a central measure of Islam is humanism, the fact that all humanity, like Allah, is one. As he says in his remarkable song, Good Lord, can you tell me what language do you laugh in? The human language of smiles and cries. What language are the tears when they're fallen from your eyes? For Brother Ali, all of humanity is one, and humanity is at the center of creation. In the same song, building on the story of the creation of Adam in the Quran, in which all of the angels bow down to Adam except for Iblis, who becomes the accursed Satan, Brother Ali asserts, God let the breath of life come outside. Satan doubted it. Angels bowed to it. I'm so beautifully human, and I'm proud of it. For Brother Ali, we're all human, the Khalifas of God, higher than the angels, and thus for Brother Ali, there is no you and no me, just us. For him, there is only one human race. Not surprisingly, his work speaks out powerfully against the legacy of white supremacy, which he sees as the great sin of American history, precisely because it divides humanity. This is at the heart of his song, The Travelers, which describes in detail the horrors of the Middle Passage and plantation slavery, noting that the unintended but inevitable end of that institution is that the institution of slavery and racism destroys the humanity of the slave owners themselves. Brother Ali's music is a powerful call for his largely white audience to recognize the unfair privilege they have been given by the legacy of racism and to reject it. It is crucial to note that for Brother Ali, these humanistic values don't come from secularism. They come from and are rooted in his Islam. To be kind, compassionate, and respectful are Muslim values. Beyond this, as a Muslim, one can be cool and hip and seen as such by non-Muslims. As he affirms in Good Lord, Imam Muhammad might pound on the podium, Popmaster Fable works it out in the linoleum, Chappelle bust funnies, Most Def bust rhymes, and Muhammad Ali was the greatest of all time. By citing these famous American Muslims, he makes the point that not only are Muslims not aliens in America, they are at the center of what is hip and cool in the American experience. And who would deny that Brother Ali, as a Muslim artist himself, radiates that same coolness and hipness? The African American community is the largest single Muslim community in the United States, and yet we tend in common parlance to think of Islam as primarily an immigrant phenomenon. Too often, Muslims and non-Muslims alike treat immigrant Muslims as the real Muslims. I'm reminded of the African American scholar who writes about being interviewed after 9/11 on the phone by a journalist who said, "Boy, you're so articulate and you have so much great things to say, you need to be on TV." And she shows up at NPR. And they go, "Oh, you're African American. We thought you were a real Muslim." Now, to be fair, the experience of immigrant Muslims is very different from that of African Americans. Immigrant Muslims largely came to the United States in the second half of the 20th century following the immigration reforms of President Johnson. These policies favored the immigration of highly educated persons. As a result, it should be noted that immigrant Muslims are one of the most highly educated and economically successful communities in North America. For them, for most of y'all, the issues of the homeland were often the issues that burned most broadly in terms of social justice. Palestine, Kashmir, the oppression of people under the Shah of Iran. That's to be understood. Immigrant communities always bring what comes from the homeland. But as numerous scholars on this issue have pointed out, the relationship between African American and immigrant Muslim communities have never been as strong as they could be. And some of these scholars postulate that it's precisely the issue of the racial history of America that lies at the heart of that division. For African American Muslims, the struggle against white supremacy remains at the core of their Islam. If Islam is about justice, is there any bigger issue than the question of race? For their perspective, immigrant Muslims have never fully understood the experience of racism in America. So what does this have to do with politics? Ultimately, politics, as I define it, and I'll throw this out there and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong or not, is about a couple of important questions. Two questions. Number one, with whom do we stand? That's the first political question. And the second is, for whom do we stand? For immigrant Muslims, these issues have been complex. There was a time when many immigrant Muslims supported the right wing in America because the right was for lower taxes, it was pro-business, and it shared the social conservatism of many people who came from conservative countries. But in the last few years, Muslims have moved towards the left. This is the left. Largely as a result of the community's recognition that it is in fact a minority community. If the left is about standing up for those who have the least, it strikes me, at least it's my opinion, that this is a logical place for American Muslims to stand. Muslims should stand with immigrants, with African Americans, with those who are poor, with those who lack access to health care and education. I believe with our African American brothers and sisters that Islam should be a tradition of resistance not only to white supremacy, but to all forms of oppression. And why do I believe this? Because I believe that the Ahl Bayt tradition calls us to this. Let me begin by saying that for me, one of the most important aspects of the Prophet Muhammad, one that every pre-modern Muslim knew but has been ignored in the 21st century in most of the political discourse about Islam, is that the Prophet ﷺ was a fakir. He and his family lived lives of voluntary poverty because they continually gave of what they had in service to others. Why does the Quran consistently ask us to think of widows and orphans and travelers? Because at the heart of Islam is the belief that true humanity, true insaniyat, is to be found not in a political struggle for one's own advantage, but in the struggle to help others. This is an aspect of Islam that finds its way into the Sufi tradition, where Muwainuddin Chishti becomes famous as Gharib Nawaz. Why is he Gharib Nawaz? Even now, the Chishti tariqat says that whatever comes into the khanqa in the morning has to be given out to the poor at night, because that's the model of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I also think it is no surprise that it is precisely those minority traditions in the Sunni world that reject the importance of the Ahlul Bayt, the Wahhabis, the radical Salafis, that have sought to recast Islam as a kind of prosperity theology that makes the argument that you should be a pious Muslim because if you do, you can become wealthy and powerful and successful. What does that say about the Prophet's patched cloak? It is no coincidence, I believe, that Ali's main supporters were the Ansar and the New Muslims, not the Quraysh. It is no surprise to me that Ali's heroism and his valor are sung throughout Eurasia, even by Sunni Muslims, because Zulfiqar has become a sign of justice for those on the periphery of society, and it has been that way for centuries. The martyrdoms of Ali and Hussein and all of the 12 Imams and Fatima Zahra are signs of the willingness of those who are the true examples of Insan al-Kamil to offer every sacrifice for justice for those who have the least. All of this brings me circuitously back to the issues of for whom and with whom should we stand. I believe that a Muslim perspective on politics, an Ahlul Bayt perspective, needs to be a perspective that stands with those on the bottom of society. We need to be a beacon for social justice, not just for Muslims, but for everyone who is among the poor and the oppressed. In America, I believe that the bellwether for social justice remains coming to grips with America's history of race and racism. To that end, we need to make common cause with those in the African American community, especially the African American Muslim community that stands not only for an end to discrimination, but for an end to the continuing legacy of American white supremacy that has resulted in the incredibly high proportion of African Americans in prison and in poverty. We should similarly be the loudest and most prominent voices against domestic violence, against women, because whatever it says in Surah 434, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam never struck his wives. We should call for access to work and health care for all Americans because we are called to command the good and to forbid evil. We are called not only to prayer but to action. Now, it's no surprise to most of you that I came to Islam through the path of the Ahlul Bayt and through the passion of Muharram. One day I was in Karachi before I was a Muslim, and there was a dervish there, and the dervish had come to Islam. He was also a convert. He was from Australia or New Zealand, I forget which. And he asked me if I was a Muslim and said, well, I love the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, but I don't pray and I don't fast. And he says, Vernon, the people who murdered Imam Hussein, they said all 5 prayers the day they killed him. Now, I'm not saying that to say that prayer is not important, because the same day I met someone else who told me, why do we pray? We pray because Imam Hussein prayed every prayer the day they killed him. What I am saying is that prayer is not enough. Prayer is not enough. You can be a good person who prays or a bad person who prays. The sign of whether or not your submission to God is taking fruit is, are you doing good for the other? I was on a train once in the Punjab, and there was this guy, he was all Pakka Musliman, he had the right beard, he had, the pants that were the right length. Time came for prayer, so he lays out his thing, and this child, couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, walks in front of him, got in the way when he wanted to pray. So what did he do? He took the back of his hand and knocked him across the train car, because he got in the way of his ibadat. And you know what? Everybody on the train knew that was wrong. We all know that's wrong, that ibadat's not an end in itself, that Islam is about akhlaq, and there are no greater models of akhlaq than the Prophet and the Ahl-Bayt, and they stand as a beacon saying, you know where you stand? You stand for fixing history. You stand for making the pristine Medina, not back then, but in a future where we're going to make a just world for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, for the person who has been locked out of society. For me, and I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I take the responsibility for saying it, that's what Islam is all about. The African American community continually reminds us that Islam requires us to stand for justice as well as piety. The Quran speaks not only of Muslims, but of those who believe in God and in the Qiyamah and who do good works. With whom and for whom do we stand? We should stand with the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed, whatever their faith tradition. Our issue should not only, nor even primarily be about ourselves, but about the general welfare of the most needy. We should stand with others who do that, whether they're Muslims or not, because they're our natural allies. And when they see Muslims as the kind of people who stand up for the oppressed because of their religion, that is, I believe, the most powerful dawah that we as Muslims can do. Thank you very much.